네, 안녕하십니까.
Good afternoon.
전체 세션 1에서는
Welcome to Plenary Session 2.
기본소득
The theme of the Plenary Session 2 is Unconditional Basic Income and Commonwealth Dividend. From Session 1, we looked at basic income in politics.
무조건적 기본소득과
In Session 2, we're going to talk about Unconditional Basic Income and Commonwealth Dividend. And the basic order, or how things will go, would be basically the same. We will have two presenters.
먼저
First, we
가이스텐든 교수님입니다.
have Professor Kai standing. I don't think he needs further explanation, but let me just give you a brief introduction.
기본소득지구네트워크 공동
He is one of the co-founders of the Basic Income Earth Network, and he is the honorary chair, and currently he is a research associate at SOAS, University of London.
많이 번역돼 있고
And many of his books were translated in Korea as well. And I, last year, introduced his book, The Plunder of the Commons, to my students. And this was a very
감명을 받았습니다.
great book that summarized the history of the plunder of the commons.
그 발표가 먼저 있겠습니다.
So first we're going to have a presentation by Guy Standing. Professor Standing, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a very great pleasure to be back in Seoul. It's the first city in the world to have had two Basic Income Earth Network conferences, so that's a special feature in itself. And what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is, I believe, very close to the spirit of Korea. As all you Koreans know, but many of us do not know, Korea was founded in BC 3333, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a long time ago. And it was founded on the principle of Hongik Ingan. Now, I apologize if I have the pronunciation wrong, but the ethos of Hongik Ingan is community and individuality, coming from some of the things that Philippe was speaking about earlier this morning, about fraternity and freedom. And the sense of Hongik Ingan goes all the way through. As you know, Seoul has been called the sharing city. And it's embodied in another concept, which Hayang Hak, the sense of village communities. Now, we know that the Japanese in their occupied period here did a lot to destroy that ethos of solidarity and community and the commons, but they failed. And that, I think, is why there is a resonance in Korea for basic income, because I think it is grounded in our sense of the commons. And my work over the last 20 years, if not more, has been trying to blend a perspective based on the commons, in the sense that I've always believed that we will only win and have a basic income as meaningful part of a new income distribution system if basic income is part of a new progressive politics of the 21st century that escapes from the politics of the 20th century, which was between social democrats and Christian democrats, or neoliberals, and so on. The Commons provides a different perspective on reviving society. Now, the work that I've been doing, I'm very privileged that The Plunder of the Commons has been translated. It looks beautiful in Korean. I only hope the translation reads as well as it does in English. And I have a new book out, which has just come out, called The Blue Commons. And as many of you know, in 1982, we had the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, under which the Republic of Korea gained 557,000 square kilometers of sea. So your sea area is 4.7 times your land area, surface-wise. That means, just as in many other countries, that what happens in the sea is a vitally important part of understanding the future of the political economy and politics. And it gets remarkably little attention. I've recently been involved in a number of controversies because under the United Nations Convention, what is outside the economic zones is part of the common heritage of humanity. It belongs to all of us equally under the law, and it has to be shared. And at the moment, multinational capital is trying to plunder it, aided by China, and we have a real threat that we, the commoners, will be losing a vital part of the world economy going forward. I won't go into the details of that, I will run out of time. But we are in a very important, pivotal point in the global transformation. Karl Polanyi's idea of the Great Transformation. We have been living through a disembedded phase of first neoliberal capitalism and then what I call rentier capitalism, where more and more of the income has been flowing to the owners of private property, financial property, physical property, and most of all, so-called intellectual property. And less has been going to those who perform labor and work. And in the process, there has been a plunder of the commons, the natural commons, the social commons, the civil commons, the cultural commons, the knowledge commons. And they've been turned into sources of huge rental income. That is illegitimate. That is unjust. That has no moral principle justifying what's been happening. And we should be very angry. And that anger should be part of our progressive politics and is linked to the proposals that I've been trying to develop. Now, in the process of this rentier capitalism, what has happened is that a new class structure has taken place with the precariat, which has also been translated into Korean, and we're living in an age of chronic economic uncertainty. Now, as every economist knows, uncertainty is a very specific form of insecurity. It's when we have unknown unknowns, when we are fragile because we cannot work out the probability of being hit by a shock or a hazard or something that could have devastating consequences. Whether it's pandemics, whether it's economic crises, whether it's natural disasters, they keep coming at us. And this uncertainty cannot be dealt with by the welfare state institutions and policies of the 20th century, of Beveridge and Bismarck and the welfare systems that were based on contingency risks. that you could work out the probability of being hit and work out the probability so that you could have compensation. With uncertainty, people are chronically insecure and they have no sense of being able to have an anchor in their lives. Obviously, for those of us supporting basic income, that is a huge development because we need ex-ante protection, not ex-post compensation, to give us robustness and resilience. So that is the context. And at the same time, the old social democratic fiscal policy of progressive income tax and consumption tax doesn't work in a globalized economy where rents are being earned, where people can park their incomes in tax havens and so on. So we need a fiscal reform which I call an eco-fiscal strategy. And it comes back to the commons. What are the commons? The commons are what belong to all of us. They're not open access because they require a governance structure with stewards or trustees preserving the commons and with gatekeeper organizations holding those stewards to account. It goes back, in my particular culture, to the Justinian Codex of AD 529, which established 4 types of property: private property, state property, nobody's property, commons. And the sea and the land and the seabed and all natural resources and social institutions bequeathed to us as commons are separate and identifiable. A commons is inappropriable by private interests or state interests. But we've seen the plunder diminishing the commons in many respects. In the books, I've tried to enunciate 7 governance principles of a commons. Don't have time to go through them, they're discussed in the book. They include the public trust doctrine. The stewards have a duty to preserve the commons as an equal value. The intergenerational equity principle, which means that the stewards, the sovereign, has responsibility for preserving the commons for generations and generations in the future. Very important for the sort of proposal I'm about to make. It includes the social memory principle, that if it's uncontested as a commons for a certain period, then you preserve it as a commons. A precautionary principle, right to subsistence and right to habitat, and deliberative democracy principles. I won't go into them, but they're there. Now, what would be an eco-fiscal strategy if one wanted to preserve the commons, revive the commons, and if one wanted to deal with the problems of rentier capitalism and uncertainty? I believe, and it goes with what Nam was speaking about earlier, that we need to produce a system of common capital funds. The common capital funds should be built on the principles that those who are taking from the commons, who are making profits from our commons, should compensate the commoners. And those who are polluting the commons, diminishing our commons, should be compensating those who are suffering as a consequence. In that sense, I believe deserving is an issue, because you need to say that if somebody pollutes and as a result you die earlier, you should be compensated, figuratively speaking. And I think that this principle is something that most people can easily understand. It's important to think, if we establish a commons fund, how would we raise the income for that fund? What I've proposed is a situation of several levies. I prefer the sense of levy, so you leave tax in the term for income tax, consumption tax, capital tax, and so on, for your public services or whatever you want to use for government expenditure. A levy system would include the one that we had discussed earlier so brilliantly, which is a carbon levy. We need a carbon levy. We will not tackle global warming unless we have seriously high levies on the use of carbon. Let's be serious. Only Sweden has really established a serious carbon levy, but any country can do it. We also need a land value levy. The land was a commons. Now it is taken and used and exploited. So those who have benefited should be compensating the rest of the commoners. Among the others, there are smaller ones. But let me just mention just a few. I've got about 20. They're all similar character. You have a minerals levy. The minerals are taken, turned into profit, and are taking from our common resources. That's pretty clear. So they should be paying what Tom Paine would have called a ground rent on taking from the commons. The same with taking from the sea. You have fish quota systems, you have fishing access agreements where the beneficiaries are taking the fish from around Korea, for example. The Chinese are plundering your fish populations, but are only paying a fraction of the cost. We should have a levy on what they're doing. But there are many others, like a frequent flyer levy. Many people, including some of us in this room, are guilty of flying very frequently. Our flying produces pollution, which is devastatingly bad for the health of people not doing it. Think of the ports, our ports, which are mainly now owned by financial capital, incidentally. The ports, the big ships, when they go in, they keep their diesel engines going all the time, polluting the water and the air, resulting in the premature deaths by cancer of thousands and thousands of people around the port communities. They should have a heavy levy put on, which would discourage them doing it, but until they stop doing it, they would be raising the funds. A number of the other levies I don't have time to discuss, but they are discussed in the books. And those levies should be paid into what is a commons fund. We often hear of the Alaska Fund, which has been a sad disaster. A far better example is the Norwegian Capital Fund. And the Norwegian fund acts like a commons, but it only has one source of revenue, and that's oil and gas in the North Sea. But what the fund has done is adhere to commons principles. And the commons principles start with the intergenerational equity principle. You can only recycle the revenue you get from, say, a carbon levy if you preserve the capital value of the resource. With carbon, you can recycle practically all of it. But if you're talking about a diminishing resource like oil or gas or minerals, or what they're talking about the deep sea mining at the moment, you're talking about a diminishing resource. And there you have to apply the intergenerational principle, because you must not treat the revenue as a windfall gain to be sent to everybody today. because that would be unjust on future generations of commoners. You can only recycle the revenue from diminishing exhaustible resources from the investments made by the capital fund. Now, I've estimated that the various forms, not just carbon, not just energy, but the various types of eco-fiscal levies would very quickly produce a very big capital fund. Now, the Norwegians calculate that the net return on the investment by their fund, net of management costs, is 4% per year. That means that there is 4% of their revenue that can be recycled, potentially as dividends, common dividends. But the great thing about a commons fund is that many of the sources of revenue for the fund are not held down by the intergenerational equity principle, because they are renewable resources. And those renewable resources can be recycled almost in entirety. I've argued in the various types of levies that in some cases they are replenishable resources, so that they require some expenditure to reproduce. For example, a forestry levy where people are taking from our forests, making profit, you have to use part of the revenue to replenish the forests. But that still leaves about 80% of the levy from that source that can be recycled as dividends. And the interesting thing is that it has a number of positive effects automatically built into the Commons Capital Fund and common dividends. First of all, of course, it is an ecological approach. It is a really strategic way of confronting the biggest single crisis of our time, because it is penalizing those who are doing the polluting, who are doing the global warming, who are destroying nature, and in every respect, they're paying a price that will discourage them. But while they are being discouraged, they will be paying into the fund. The great thing is that the fund itself can be built up as a stabilization device, a macroeconomic stabilization device, which we need in the face of all these international crises, and as a way of dealing with public debt and dealing with the distributional crisis of our time that we are now all about. The inequalities are fundamentally due to capital taking rents from our commons. And if we took those rents back and recycled them through this fund, then you would reduce one of the major, if not the major source of inequality growth in our era. It's a matter of common justice. The commoners should be compensated. But it's also, if you're religious, it's also a matter of religious justice. Pope Francis, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, wrote a very public letter. And it's got a beautiful sentence. Whether believers or not, we are agreed today that the earth is essentially a shared inheritance whose fruits are meant to benefit everyone. Today, those fruits do not benefit the many. They benefit a very tiny number of obscene plutocrats and an elite. I've found that when one talks about the commons and talks about the meaning of the commons as a way of life, a way of commoning, a way of shared existence, a way of relating differently to nature, than is imagined under capitalism otherwise. People get it. You don't have to be an avid left-wing person or right-wing or whatever. People soon get the idea. The commons is what belongs to us, and commoning is what we want to do. I don't want to be permanently in a job, but I want to work. I want to common. I want to live in a convivial environment. And thinking along the lines of commoning, which is where my new book is about to come out, The Politics of Time, means a different way of living. And common dividends and this Commons Capital Fund would be important parts of the fiscal route to enabling us to live a better type of life, working and commoning and indulging in real leisure. That's a vision for all of us, I think. So thank you very much for listening.
예, 가이스트닝 교수님 발표.
Thank you very much, Professor Standing. Please give another big hand.
발표에서는 공유주 약탈 문제와 새로운 시스템 설계.
So the presentation was about the plunder of the commons and a new eco-fiscal reform and commons capital fund.
발표 중에 좀 이해가 안 되신 용어나.
So do you have clarifying questions about the terms? If there is none, let us move on to the second presentation by Professor Jeonghee of Kunsan National University.
그 기본소득.
Professor Seo is a director of the Institute for Basic Income as part of the Basic Income Korea network.
안녕하세요. 기본소득 한국네트워크 이사 기본소득 연구소 소장 맡고 있는 서정희라고
Nice to meet you. My name is Jeonghee.
제가 이번 세션에서 말씀드릴 이 이야기들은 저와 지금 저기 앉아 계시는 기본소득 한국네트워크 이사장이신 안효상 이사장.
My presentation was based on the paper co-authored with Professor An Hyo-sang, co-chair of the organizing committee of the Congress.
기본소득의 실현 가능성이 많이 높아졌습니다.
So we started this research
없지만 사실
in the backdrop of
좋은 대선을
increasing visibility of basic income. If we had a better results in the last presidential elections, we could have expected a good basic income institutionalization, but that is not what has happened, which is regrettable. Anyway, Korea has seen
경쟁들 속에서
some policies with the name of basic income,
소득의 일종이다. 뭐 참여소득,
including youth basic income and emergency basic income and so on. And many people were talking about
실현 가능성이 높아지면서 사실상
a lot of variants of basic income.
쟁점들은 약간 변화되어 왔습니다.
And in that process, the main issues of basic income have changed over time. At the beginning of the discussion on basic income, it was about the general justification of basic income and how to finance it. But as time went by, the discussion became more specific in Korea with some new issues as I outlined them here.
실험들이 이것은 기본소득이다.
So there are so many basic income policies or pilot programs
제기가 됐는데
that
무엇이 기본?
that claim to be basic income. So the first question is, what is basic income and what is not basic income? Is negative income tax basic income? Is participatory income scheme a basic income? I don't think so.
기본소득을 구성하고 있는 이 구성 요건들에 대해서
So the question is about the components of basic income, and we wanted to look at that more in detail. And the second issue
한 번에
is
시행될 때
about the path or strategy to introduce a complete basic income.
베이직 인컴에서는 좀 수정된
Now, in reality, it's very difficult to introduce a complete basic income. So you see a lot of compromises in many variants of proposals. Like you need to start with youth basic
해야
income.
된다. 이렇게
You need to start with emergency basic income.
그랬을 때 무엇이 더
That can be monthly or quarterly. And the question is, which option is the best?
수준이지만 모두에게 제공되는 부분 기본
Is youth basic income a better way, or is a small universal basic income the best for a full and complete basic income to be introduced?
층위에서 다 똑같이 중요한 걸까? 라는
So we wanted to look at whether we should value all the different types of basic income programs the same way.
구성되는 것이 아니라 만약에 위계가 있다면
And if we can find priorities
각 요건들 사이
when it comes to the conditions or components of basic income programs, we can choose the best option or strategy to move to basic income in the long term. So the assumption of the research is first, not all basic components of basic income are not on the same dimension. And therefore, based on the different priorities of the components, we can design the better options or better path to full basic income.
그 각 요건들이 어떤 중요성들을 가지고 있는지
So we wanted to look at 6 components or aspects of basic income.
그리고 그 위계들을 토대로 제도적인 위계 또한 설정해 보았습니다.
And find priorities and also try to come up with different combinations of them.
구성하는 요건은 5가지입니다.
So based on the definition of basic income, there are 5 aspects: universality, unconditionality, individuality, periodicity, and cash payment.
2016년
And although not being part of the official definition, we also have the principle of sufficiency agreed upon in the last Congress in Seoul.
보고 이것을 그런데 이제 이 정의와 관련해서 정의는 간단한데 각
So
논자들마다
the definition of basic income looks simple. However, there are still disagreements, even among the advocates of basic income here. And they use different
것인가 이 판별
aspects,
유의미성을 살펴보고자 합니다.
and we wanted to evaluate them.
모두에게 지급된다.
So, universality, it means a very simple thing. Basic income is provided to all people.
특정 공동체 내에서 모두에게 지급되는가 또는
So, to assess whether this condition is met, you need to see whether all members of a community is given basic income. But there is an issue remaining.
기존의 사회 정책으로
Actually, I majored social policy, and the traditional dichotomy in social policy has been universal versus selective.
연령 집단에게 한정하는
For example,
정책의 틀로 설명.
if
그런데 기본소득에서도
basic income is limited to children or the elderly, that can be seen as universal from the traditional social policy perspective. However, from the perspective of basic income, it is not universal. So the concepts of universality in traditional social policy and basic income actually contradict each other.
보편성과 무조건성이 하나의 선상에 존재합니다. 하나의 기준,
Now,
두 개의 기준이 아니라
basic income advocates treat universality and unconditionality as one same condition.
노동수당이나 뭐 장애수당, 기초연금 같은 것들을 보편적 급여라고 지칭했고 보편주의라고
So, in the traditional social policy,
하는 청년 기본수당, 청년 기본소득
allowances provided to all members of a certain group, for example, children, the elderly, or people with disabilities, are universal because it is based on attributed needs.
있습니다. 기존의 사회 정책에서
From this perspective, there's no place for basic income because it does not consider attributed needs.
가깝고 더 좋은 것이다 라고 설명할 수 있는 근거가 없었습니다. 그렇다면
So from this perspective, you cannot say that truly universal basic income is better than youth basic income. That's why the concept of universality in basic income should be evolved.
따라서 기본소득의
That was why we decided to distinguish universality from unconditionality.
설명해 내야 합니다. 이런 문제의식에서 기본소득의 보편성이라는 것을 사회정책의 보편성을 승계하면서도
So, from this perspective, the universality of basic income should inherit the universality of traditional social policy and at the same time take a step forward to not limiting
보편성을
the target group based on attributed needs.
이렇게 판별해야 된다.
Therefore, from the perspective of basic income, child allowance, for example, is not universal.
기준입니다. 기존의
So this condition of universality is meaningful.
이라는 범주, 이 카테고리를 근거로 해서 어느 정도의 배타성
Traditionally, social policies have been exclusive to citizens based on the citizenship system, but basic income is for all people.
것처럼 이 공유부
And as Professor Guy Standing described very well, basic income comes from commonwealth, the equity of which belong to all people.
지분을 가지고 있다라고 그리고 이것을 향유할
All people have the same amount of equity in the commonwealth of a society
소득이 가지고 있는
and accordingly have the right to enjoy it.
하지만 실현 이후
And the universality of basic income is crucial for introduction as well as sustaining basic income after introduction
연구들이 이미 존재합니다.
because it provides political momentum. There is a lot of literature on this topic. The second issue is unconditionality. So there should be no conditions attached.
논자들마다 굉장히 다양한 방식으로 설명되어 왔습니다.
Now, this aspect has been explained in diverse ways, depending on researchers.
근로 조건이 없어야 된다는 겁니다.
One common element is
다만
there should be no condition for work.
특히 물론 이제
However, there are disagreements regarding other aspects.
격렬한 논쟁들이 예상되는데
I think in this year's Congress, there will be another heated discussion about the definition of basic income.
나는 부연 설명을 달면서 약간 오해의 여지가 생기는
And now I think the BN website's explanation on basic income says basic income does not have is not means tested. But I think this description might lead to confusion. Now, here's the difference in the table. On the BN website,
것 같습니다. 95년에서
it says basic income
가족 형태에 대한 조건 없음
is not conditional to work, but on the website of Basic Income Korean Network, it says basic income is not means tested and is not conditional to work. It seems the position of Professor Van Parijs has shifted a little bit in his writings in 1995.
없는 것.
There were four conditions: no means stated, no condition for work, no condition for family type, and no condition for locality. But in 2006, he only mentions the first two aspects.
자산조사 조건이 없는 것, 소비 조건이 없는 것.
Now, Professor Standing
그다음에 행위 조건이 없는 것.
talks about no means tested or income tested, no condition for expenses, and no condition for behavior.
봐야 할 것인가에 대해서 이제 다양한
So there's some differences about how do you describe unconditionality.
라고 보는데 크게
So I think you need to answer these two questions. First,
특성 지표인가 무조건성
is no means tested an indicator for universality or unconditionality?
고용 조건 뭐 등등의 행위 조건 이런 수많은 조건의 종류를 어디까지 이 조건성으로 보아야 할 것인가.
And the second question is, what are the conditions when you say things other than means tested and condition for work?
아까 처음에 보편성에서 말씀드린 것처럼 기존의 사회적
And I believe that there should be no condition whatsoever for us to be able to say basic income is unconditional.
귀속적인 속성으로
No means tested, no condition for expenses, behavior, or work.
빈곤하지 않은 거는 귀속적 속성이 아니라 이 재산 뭐 이런 조사가 필요한 추가적인 조사가 필요한 조건이기 때문에
Now, whether you are poor or not is not attributed characteristic. It requires investigation. So,
이 무조건성의
means test
이지만 추가적인
or income, the condition for income, should be excluded.
생각합니다. 그래서
And the same goes for behavior or work.
행위 조건, 근로 조건 이런 것들은 무조건성의
So you can say basic income is unconditional when there is no condition whatsoever.
이 유의미성은
Now there are four points regarding the meaning of this aspect.
가장 중요한
Now unconditionality is one of the most crucial reasons for realizing a Republican concept of freedom.
중요한 특성입니다.
Second, it is also a key characteristic of basic income that shows that is linked to Commonwealth dividend.
에서 잘 드러나고 있는 것처럼
And third, unconditionality is crucial in increasing political feasibility,
그리고 시행할 수 있습니다.
as it can be understood as expansion of welfare programs.
다른 제도들과 다른 제도들에 비해서
And fourth,
기본소득하고 중요하다는 측면.
it also shows that basic income is better than other policy alternatives that compete with basic income.
가능한 이야기입니다.
Now, ex-ante basic income is better than NIT, negative income tax, as exposed redistribution.
단위가 아니라 개인 단위로 지급하여야 한다.
Now, the third condition is individuality. It should be provided to individuals, not families or households.
가구 전체의 급여를 세대주에게 지급하는가?
So in reality, you need to see whether it's given to individuals or the head of the households.
중요성이 낮은 건 아니죠.
It sounds simple, but it doesn't mean it's less important.
하고 있고
So individuality
라는 중요성을 가지고 있습니다.
shows that all individuals of society are equal and there's no discrimination
이 가구
in terms of
단위라는 것은 가구
the form of family or household.
단위되어 있지 않죠. 투표권도 그 어떤
And it also conveys the meaning of recognition of the holder of the rights.
볼 수 있는 중요한
Third, it has the potential to change unjust power relations in a certain group or relations. For example, for the emancipation of women.
성에 그치지 않고 일정
The
기간
fourth aspect is periodicity.
사실상
It should not be a one-off payment. It should be provided periodically.
하나는 정기적인 간격이라는 측면이 있고요. 또 하나는
And there are two indicators. First, a regular interval, and
된다고 해서 그것이
continued
때 과연 이
distribution, continued provision.
갖추고 있는가? 그렇지 않다고 생각합니다. 그래서 두 가지 특성들이 존재하고, 그래서 이 정기성의 유의미성은 삶의 안정성을 담보하는 중요한 조건으로서
So periodicity is an important condition that guarantees stability of life.
다섯 번째 원칙은 이제 현금
The fifth condition is cash payment,
가 아니고 현물 급여가
not in kind, but cash.
것인데 한국 사회에서 이것이 이제 사실 다른 국외 논의에서는 현금성 원칙이
Now,
된 적은 별로 없어요.
in the international discussion, this principle was not really a matter of controversy, but it was in Korea because the youth basic income and the emergency basic income have been provided in the form of local currency. Now, this local currency or voucher is
그래서 지역화폐는 물론
a cash equivalent because it does not violate the principle of cash payment. Of course, there is some limitation to the use of this local currency or local voucher because you cannot pay with that in a
없습니다.
premise with a certain amount of sales threshold.
합의되지는 않은
But it does not fully violate the principle of cash payment. So the sixth principle is sufficiency. Now, there is no official general agreement on that
이라는 것 또는 생계 수준이라는 것을 규정하기가 굉장히 어려워요.
because it's difficult to actually define what basic means or a sufficient level of
사회적인
quality of life means.
절대적인 어떤 기준이 되지는 못합니다.
So there is no absolute definition of sufficiency.
기본 소득에 대해서 그런 기본 소득이 아니라고 주장할
However, I don't think it's appropriate to say that small basic income is not basic income.
이렇게 판가름할 수는 없다고 생각하고요.
Just because basic income is, for example, 500,000 Korean won, it doesn't mean it's not a basic
하는
income.
것이 처음에는 뭐 10만 원에서 시작해서 점차 늘어날 수 있는 것이기 때문에
And you can start with a small amount and then increase it over time.
그렇다고 해서 기본 소득이 충분성이 중요하지 않냐.
However, it doesn't mean that sufficiency is irrelevant.
정의하는 것은 현실적으로 불가능하지만
Realistically, it's impossible to have a clear definition of sufficiency, but it is a crucial element for basic income. It should be achieved to some extent. If it's too small,
수 없지만 요건으로
if the amount is too small, it cannot be called basic.
드립니다. 그랬을 때 이 각각의
So my proposal is to include sufficiency as one of the elements, not essentially part of the definition.
것이 중요한가?
So let's take a look at the priorities or hierarchy of these six principles or aspects of basic income.
그렇다면 무엇을 근거로 우선순위를 정해야 할까? 두 가지라고 생각합니다.
And what would be the basis for defining the priorities? I think we need to look at two things. First, where does the legitimacy of basic income come from?
첫 번째 기본소득의 정당성과 원천은 공유부 배당에 있다고 생각합니다.
Of course, the source of basic income and the legitimacy comes from where the legitimacy comes from is Commonwealth dividend.
정당성을 직접적으로 드러내지는 않습니다.
Now, the six principles or aspects of basic income I've mentioned do not automatically express the legitimacy of basic income.
원칙적으로 천명하고 있습니다.
Now, the definition of basic income by BIKN
기본소득은 공유부에 대한
says
구성원의
that
몫으로
basic income
로
is
정기적으로 현금
provided on the basis of all members of society's rights to commonwealth.
당은 앞에서 가이스팅님도 잘 이야기해 주셨지만 그래서 제가 좀 더 짧게 얘기하겠습니다.
So where does this concept of commonwealth come from? Many scholars have argued for it, including Thomas Paine.
존재한다는 거죠.
So there is wealth commonly created by a society, and there is a natural commonwealth and artificial commonwealth. Natural commonwealth is wealth or production from nature, which belongs to all people. And artificial commonwealth is wealth where the individual contribution cannot be measured.
무조건적으로 개별적으로 똑같이 분배하는 것 이외에
So there's no other way but to
더 정확히 말하면 보편성
unconditionally and equally distribute commonwealth as basic income.
서로가 서로를 지지하는 굉장히
Therefore, universality, unconditionality, and individuality cannot be separated from one another, and they support one another. In that sense, the three aspects
공화주의적 자유
have priority over the other three. Let's look at the second point. What's the purpose of basic income? It is Republican freedom.
어떤 선택을 할 때 간섭이 없는
In the concept of liberal freedom, freedom is defined as the freedom to choose a state of no interference. However, Republican freedom is different. It's sometimes called as freedom before liberalism. Now, Philip Petit said that
그런데 이
Republican freedom is non-dominant freedom.
사실상 이 비지배 자유의 물질적 조건에 대해서는 언급하지 않았습니다.
But Petit did not talk about the material basis for non-dominant freedom. So that was his limitation.
또 있고요.
And there are other thinkers like Daniel Reventos
물질적 기초 그리고 그
who argued for Republican freedom. And they also clearly talked about the material basis for Republican freedom.
무조건성입니다.
And in that sense, they are advocates of basic income.
자, 이런 논의들을
And for Republican freedom, unconditionality is crucial because it provides for the material basis.
를 근거로 해서 논증을 하면
So, by putting together the two things, commonwealth as source of legitimacy of basic income and Republican freedom as purpose of basic income, we can find out the priorities among these six elements or principles of basic income.
요건의 위계를 살펴보자면
So, here's the priority.
지기 되고 그 다음으로
Unconditionality comes first, followed by universality and individuality, followed by periodicity and cash payment, and lastly, sufficiency.
요건들을 이제 위계화를 하게 되면
So when you have this priority or hierarchy, you can distinguish what is basic income and what is not, and you can also evaluate the importance of a lot of variants of basic income.
기본소득인 것과 기본소득이 아닌 것을 구분할 수 있고요.
So, step one is to see whether a program is unconditional or not. With that, you can tell whether a program is basic income or not. So after that, the second step is to see universality and individuality. In step 3, you see periodicity and cash payment. And in step 4, you see sufficiency.
그렇게 되면 우리가 보통 이제 기본소득의 어떤 제도적인 변형태로서 여러 가지
So there are many variants of basic income, full basic income,
조건적이지만
unconditional, but
모두에게 제공되는
partial basic income.
요건은 충족되지 않은 우리가 partial basic income이라고 부르는 부분.
There's no sufficiency here, and then there is categorical basic income provided to only a certain group of people. And fourth, disaster or emergency basic income once provided during the pandemic. And fifth, there's participation income, conditional on socially desirable behavior. And number six, negative income tax.
아니라고 이야기하기도 합니다.
So some of these are sometimes called basic income by some people.
하자면
So based on the hierarchy or priority I define,
부분기본소득은
we can have this table.
충족시키지 못하죠. 재난기본소득은 3단계.
Now, full basic income meets all the criteria. Partial basic income does not meet sufficiency. Disaster basic income does not meet periodicity and sufficiency. And categorical basic income does not meet universality.
나머지 이제 기본소득에 대해서는 이제
And participatory income and negative income tax do not meet the
하고 더 나아가서
unconditionality
범주형 기본소득.
principle.
2단계를 이제
So I believe the last two cannot be called basic income.
기본소득. 4단계까지를 통과한 게 완전 기본소득. 그래서 이 기본소득 제도를
And among basic income, you can have this table of hierarchy.
도입한다고 할 때 특히나 이제 재정적인 어떤 한계가 존재해서 완전 기본소득을 한 번에 못 가고
So, in reality, because of financial constraint, you might have to settle for partial basic income, for example.
그 중에 아무거나 해도 다 괜찮아.
And
청년 기본소득을 하는 것보다는
you cannot say that any basic income, partial basic income, is good.
라고 생각합니다.
And for example, youth basic income is worse than partial and universal basic income. Thank you very much.
네, 신정희 교수님 수고하셨습니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Seo. She talked about the status and what's happening in reality and also touched upon the concept of a basic income. Then we will move into the discussion session.
네. 이제부터 토론.
Okay, we will begin the discussion.
교수님, 카리스는 교수님 수고하셨습니다.
Professor Seo, Professor Standing, thank you very much for your presentations. So how we're going to do this is just like the previous session.
여기 지금 진행되고 있는 방식이 온라인과 오프라인.
Well, we have participants from both on and offline. So
오프라인 프로에서
just to clarify, we would take questions first from the offline floor. Second, we will be taking questions from online participants.
온라인에서 발표하는 질문하는 식으로 질문하시고 대답.
So offline first and then online second. So from the floor, do we have any questions? Please raise your hand and please state your name and affiliation before asking questions. We have 4 people raising their hands. Why don't we start with the front row or maybe in the back?
Hello, my name is Roberto Merrill. I work at the University of Minho in Portugal. And my question is for Professor Seo. So that was a lot of, I don't know what you have for breakfast, but I want to have the same thing because it's a lot of thoughts. But at some point, you asked one question, and I'm not sure that you replied to it. You said the requirement of no means tested. You asked, is it a property of unconditionality or of universality? And I didn't get the reply. Do you think no means tested applies better to unconditionality or to universality? It's a clarification question. I'll leave the rest, all the questions for other people.
예, 무조건성
That goes to unconditionality.
다음 질문하십니다.
Any other questions?
Yes. 네, 부탁드립니다.
Please go ahead.
여기 제일 먼저 앞에 분이요.
So we have this person in the front row.
Eduardo.
Suplicy from Brazil. I have a question to Professor Guy Stanning. You have qualified the Alaskan experience as a disaster. I would like to know why. Because first, the beginning of the Alaska Permanent Fund started with a very democratic way. The mayor of the Bristol Bay, a fisherman village, observed that a huge amount of wealth was coming out from that village, but still many people were poor. So he said, let us have a 3% tax on fish. Another tax, I'm against it. It took 5 years for him to persuade the community. Once it was approved, it did so well that 10 years later, Jay Hammond was elected the governor of the state of Alaska. It so happened that at the Prudhoe Bay in North Alaska, they discovered a huge amount of wealth, of oil reserves. So Jay Hammond told his 300,000 people, we need to think not only in our generation, but in the future generation, because oil is a non-renewable resource. Let us separate 25% of the royalties coming out from the exploitation of oil reserves so as to build a fund that will pertain to all. And he wanted everybody to debate and to vote. 76,000 people said yes, 38 no. 2-1, it won. And the dividend started to be paid in the early 80s until last October, $2,384 for each person annually. It made
질문을
Alaska,
좀 짧게.
Well, can you wrap up?
it made Alaska evolved from the most unequal of the 50 American states to the most equal. So I couldn't understand why this is a disaster. Thank you.
I think I've written precisely what you've said, but I repeat, sadly, it has been a disaster. If Jay Hammond were alive today, I am sure he would agree with me. The trouble was the fund was politicized by the Republicans, who drove down the income tax to zero and left the fund having to bail out for public services. Then they had a series of disastrous political outcomes where the raiding of the fund meant that the dividends started collapsing from a good level, which they'd reached by the turn of this century. And then you had a populist candidate coming in saying, I'm going to revive the Alaska dividend, not only to its old level, but raise it, which was actually fiscally impossible really to sustain. The trouble was that the investment function of the fund was not developed independently, and the fund was not kept out of the political party system. Where the Norwegians have done so fantastically well is that their fund they have kept separate from government. So they have an independent democratic system with investment functions that they determine, not government. And they are instructed to have an ethical, ecological investment strategy, invest abroad to deal with the Dutch disease, for those of you who are economists, and to enable the fund to be a stabilization instrument. And therefore, the integrity of the Norwegian fund has been retained, whereas the Alaska fund integrity was lost. And I think the governance of a capital fund is so important. It must be democratic, it must be ethical, it must be ecological, and then you can use an independent committee to determine what level of common dividends should be paid out. With the Alaska thing, it was corrupted. Maybe that's a better word than disaster, but it was very successful for a while, and that's why we were all celebrating it back in the 90s and the early part of this century.
예, 답변 감사드립니다. 다음 질문.
Thank you very much for the answer. Any other question? We have the person in the back with the mic.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is to Professor Seo. So my name is Télémaque Masson. I'm head of the Bien Affiliate Research Program and of a working group, the Bien Working Group on the clarification of basic income's definition, together with Annie Miller, Toria Mamori, and Ali Mutlu Koiloglu. I wanted to begin by echoing Roberto Merrill's compliment and to tell you that this paper was probably one of the best one I've seen on the definition of basic income, having worked on the topic for a while, and we would really, really love for it to be translated and to have the conversation go deeper. I'd have many, thank you. I'd have many questions, but I'd keep to one very short one as respect for the other speakers here. I was very interested by what you had to say about the cash criteria. As you know, so as you mentioned, this is something that was added to Bien's definition in 2016. But you said in your presentation, I think that this point was not debated before at the international level. Yet in 1995, Philippe Van in 1995's book, Philippe used the notion of basic income in kind. And in 2004, also, Jürgen de Wisperere and Lindsay Stilton did so. Except at the time, in these writings, they would refer to basic income in kind as things like universal healthcare or universal education. Whereas you mentioned the debate around cash in Korea to be about vouchers or alternative currency. And so to keep it very short, but I would really love for this conversation to go on, has there been some talks in Korea describing universal healthcare or universal education using the basic income language or not? That would be my question for now. Thank you so much.
좋은 평가 감사합니다.
So first of all, thank you very much for appreciating this work.
또 현물 기본소득이라는 표현을 쓰는 경우들이 있어요.
Now, there were some cases in Korea where this term in-kind basic income was used, but that's only in the past. Recently, there's no.
기존의 개념으로 설명할 수 있는 것을 굳이 혼선을 가져오는 방식으로 다르게
I think
필요는 없다고
there's no need to use terms that can be confusing. Now, we're talking about basic income. It is income, and we don't want to describe services with this term of income. We don't want to alienate the advocates of social services. You know, I am a social policy major myself. I believe that universal basic income and social services are both important. we don't want to, categorize social services as basic income just because we're advocates of basic income.
설명이 좀 부족.
And I think maybe my explanation in the beginning of the presentation was insufficient. I didn't mean that there is no controversy at all regarding the cash payment principle.
그래서 이것이
I wanted to say that
디스커션을 그러니까 혹은 논란이 된 적이 별로 없었다는 거죠.
there is no actual case of controversy whether
쟁점들이 형성되지 않았었다는 거고.
basic income should be in kind or cash.
전에 지역 화폐로 제공이 되면서 이게
Because there were no actual such policies internationally. But in Korea,
기본으로 제공되는데 그런
local currencies were distributed. So there was a controversy whether this is basic income or not, whether this violates cash payment principle or not. So that was partly political, attack to those measures. So based on, according to the critics, the local currency is in violation of the cash payment principle, but I was against that because that's a cash equivalent.
서비스의 확대는 굉장히 중요.
And I think in the Korean context, expansion of universal services are crucial, like healthcare, housing, education, and so on. They are as important.
한국 네트워크도
And the Basic Income Korean Network
공명하고 있고
is supportive of expansion of such basic social services. But we don't want to call them a form of basic income.
floor은 잠깐 쉬고요. 줌에
Thank you. We will give the floor a little bit of break, and why don't we turn to our online participants?
Should I?
Mel?
Thank you. I would like to agree that Professor Sao's input was extremely useful, and would also like to get the translated version. Just a question to Prof. Standing and then a comment on Prof. Sao's input. Prof. Standing, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, as far as I know, doesn't pay a direct dividend to citizens in Norway. Can you just clarify that that's correct? But secondly, on Prof. Sao's input, I think that I would agree with her that the concept of basic income, certainly in South Africa, is highly contested and dynamic. So in South Africa, it is more of a strategic question as to what route we pursue, as opposed to a philosophical and ideological question. So while I come from a coalition called the Universal Basic Income Coalition and a think tank called the Institute for Economic Justice in South Africa, and we prefer and pursue universality. But the reality in South Africa is that we are having to campaign for basic income for adults aged 18 to 59 because we currently have income support for children and for old age people. But secondly, we are having to deal with the reality that the attainment of universality will be a progressive sort of battle, and that we're going to have to move progressively towards universality as we expand the numbers who are included. So some level of targeting is unavoidable in the short to medium term. That just reflects the balance of forces, if you like, in society, and the fact that we have to achieve the platform of basic income and expand it progressively over time. So I think Prof. Sao's input really resonated with the South African situation. Thank you.
간단하게. 네, 간단하게.
Let me just first say that the Norwegian fund does not pay out common dividends. It's the potential for using the capital fund as a way of paying out common dividends that I'm proposing, which I think the governance structure is a very important part of the fund. Listening to Neil reminds me that we've been having that debate in South Africa for the past 25 years about progressive movement towards universality. But I think the whole concept of universality is still one of the hardest ones we have in the Bien movement. What is universal? And at some point, you're going to have to make a pragmatic rule on migrants getting the basic income, however it's defined. So at some stage, the term universality is being used rather liberally. And the other thing that I think I would like to see more discussion of is the very notion of equality. We talk about the basic income should be equal, but should it be an equal amount for everybody or an equal value to everybody who's receiving the basic income? And that is a different concept, because it means paying a different amount for people who've got a different cost of living, maybe from disability or from frailty or whatever it is. So I think these concepts are still slippery, but we shouldn't probably take too much time on these definitional matters, because they do eat up an incredible amount of our energy.
교수님 간단하게 말씀하시겠습니다.
Professor Sal, please be
제가
brief.
이제 기본소득에 위계가 있다고 이야기를 말씀을 드린 건데
So I talked about the hierarchy of the principles or aspects of basic income.
좋고
So full basic income is the best, followed by partial basic income and so
한
on.
번에 모든 게 가능하다면 다
But you know, if you can achieve everything all at once, you would go for full basic income from the beginning.
내일이 말씀해 주신
But that's not the case in reality.
한국도 그런 경험들을 했습니다.
Now, Korea had this experience. Basic income was unknown to the public
어떤 건 그러면 1차적으로 청년 기본소득하자.
years ago. So there was a campaign for youth basic income
인구에 대한 지원.
in the traditional welfare system.
사실상 실업급여나 이런 어떤 조건성에 기반한 정책 이외에
Supporting the workforce was all conditional. For example, unemployment benefits.
인구를 대상으로 하는 정책.
And there were also programs targeting non-economically active populations, such as child allowance. So we wanted to target some of the economically active population. That's why we argued for youth basic income. But after some time, the concept of basic income became more, widely known.
대선을 앞두고 2년 동안
So we stopped arguing for youth basic income programs
이제는 더 이상 이
to be introduced in other regions. So we decided that it's time for us to move away from categorical basic income toward partial basic income. So $300,000 won per month.
국가가 처해 있는
So I think
선택지를 선택.
among these options,
다만
you choose the best one according to the conditions of a society. In the end, what I wanted to say is that if your choice is between youth basic income and partial basic income, the latter is better, but it's also depending on the society's conditions. Because of time constraint, we need to move on to other questions. We have a gentleman in glasses in the back.
저는 경기도에 있는 경기연구원에서
I'm with Jeonghee Institute. My name is Yu Young-seo.
선생님 오늘 발표해 주신 거에 대한 좀 질문을 드리겠는데
I have a question for Professor Seo.
하고 같이 이렇게 개별적으로 뭐 논의를 한 건 아닌데 지금 기본소득에 대한 그 특히 구성 원칙의 위계.
So your presentation was about the hierarchy and principle of basic income, and actually that really resonates with me. So it's very much encouraging. But
원칙 플러스 조건까지 포함해가지고
last year,
여기에 그 우선순위를 어떤 식으로 매기면 좋을 것인가에 대해서
I also dealt with this question of finding out the hierarchy among the six aspects. So you put forward the hierarchy based on your logical analysis. I think that is relevant in itself, but my perspective is more about introducing that as a policy in reality.
마음대로 이렇게
Now, a policy is not introduced based on logical analysis or logical conclusions among policymakers or researchers. It matters actually more for the public.
가지고 설문
It actually matters more whether the public values which aspect of the basic income.
학술제 기고를 하려다가 지금 아직까지
So my plan was to really focus on a kind of survey of the public about which aspect of basic income they value more.
굉장히 중시가
So in your logical conclusion, unconditionality comes first. But I think that the public perspective is different.
그래서 의미별로 그렇게 안 해요.
They don't really value unconditionality. That was actually a surprise to me. So I was a bit concerned. I do believe that unconditionality is important for basic income. And how should I convince people?
보편성
So that was my question.
그 외 등등등에 대해서 국민들한테 충분히 설문지 내서 이렇게 이해를 시킬 수 있을 만큼의 그런 인폼을 다 줄 수는 없어요.
You cannot provide, this presentation, for example, to the public to, enhance their awareness. You need to convince them, fighting with the existing preconceptions or misunderstanding about basic income among the public.
중요한 부분들이 굉장히 이렇게
So that's a tricky process, and there is a real risk of a degraded basic income to be introduced. And what's your view on this?
좋은 질문 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for a good
사람들이
question.
어떤 걸 더 선호하는가, 더 좋아하는가를 근거로 정책을 시행할 수는 없다고
So
생각합니다.
I don't think the public preferences cannot be the most important basis for policy.
하고
If you believe basic income is important, you need to convince the public
사람들이 기본소득이 더
that basic income is crucial. It should be unconditional, and even if it takes time.
해보지 않은 제도를
Now, the public, a huge part of the public still prefer means-tested social policy, partly because it is very difficult for people to imagine something they have not experienced. Years ago, we had a controversy of this free school lunch program. Before that was introduced, the majority of the public was against it. But once we have it, the opposition to that free school lunch program is minimal.
저게 더 좋을 것 같아라고.
So I think, the meaning of a survey at this point about do you prefer this or that when they cannot really imagine what they haven't experienced.
해야 한다고 생각하고 그 중에 하나.
Now you need to do is to convince people about the necessity of basic income, maybe using deliberative polling or deliberative forums based on civic participation.
Thank you very much. My name is Olaf Michael Ostertag from Germany, from the German network. My question goes to Professor Standing, and please forgive me if I'm asking a question that you may have elaborated on in detail in your books. You said about the levies on commons, that there could be a levy on land amongst it. And have you elaborated on what effects these levies might have on those people who are based on the actual existing laws calling themselves landowners. And let's picture a person that has a piece of land with a home just for one family on it. How would this person be affected by a levy on land? And could there be the position that the levy was even higher than the basic income generated from it and being paid backwards? So this person would actually pay net into the basic income funds.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I support a land value tax or a land value levy, but it must be a progressive levy on large scale land holding. So what I'm proposing is it should not be interpretable as a garden tax. In other words, that would apply to everybody who's got a small garden. You would only start applying it to a land that's above the mean average that's held, and that would be progressive. The thing is that land is intensely concentrated in most countries, including Korea and certainly in my own, and that is mainly due to inherited land. And that has no justification either economically, morally, or politically. And it drives up the price of land, so it drives up the rental value. So I think a land value levy is essential, and it can raise a lot of money in terms of even Milton Friedman agreed with it, because it is something that is most defensible because it's a fixed thing, and you can't evade it by opting out to go to tax havens unless you interpret it in a particular way. So I think it is, but it should be supplemented by things like what I call in the book POPs, a POPs levy, which POPs is an acronym meaning privately owned public spaces. Because one of the phenomenon that's taken place globally is the privatization of large parts of our cities and towns turned into profit making. And that is an illegitimate subtraction from the commons. And certainly it should be an extra supplement in terms of when the government gives planning permission to develop for property, it raises the value of land for everybody simply because of that institutional measure, which is an unfairness. So you can adjust it, but the commons principles have to be retained, and that's the point.
예, 수고하셨습니다. 이제 그 시간이 다
Thank you very much. Our time's up.
짧게 한 분만 딱 받겠습니다.
So one last question, very brief question.
저 뒤에 그 여성분 옆에
We have a
제일 뒤에
person
짧게 설명해 주십시오.
in the back.
시간이 다 됐습니다. 예.
Please be brief.
Hi, my name is Payfree. I'm an intern at UBI Taiwan. So my question is directed at Guy Standing. So basically my question is that how can we get nationalized industries to share their earned profits as like a shared property for the commons? Yeah, thank you.
It's a short question, but a very, very long answer. So I won't give it. I think we've got to the point now where we need a new model of nationalized industries, a mutualized thing where it's not just the state running particular industries or so on, but in allowing more cooperative development. I do discuss it in the book, but I'm happy to discuss it at greater length afterwards. But certainly it's a relevant subject, how we deal with changing the old model of nationalized industries, which was not ideal by any means.
예, 수고하셨습니다. 이제 하고 싶어도 할 수 없는 시간이 됐습니다.
Thank you very much. Now it's time we have to wrap up. Thank you very much, Professor Saab and Professor Standing. Thank you.